Well, gentlemen, we did it again. Our latest collaboration is Black Eagle Barley Wine. We previously worked together on Obadiah Poundage, 1840 London Porter. And Ron, we worked together, 6-7 years ago on Brewery, 1877 stock pale ale, Burton stock pale ale. And interestingly, because it wasn't really by design, as these all were Truman's recipes. Please, Ron, if you wouldn't mind giving us a brief history of Truman's, how long it existed, because it doesn't exist anymore, and what are the key takeaways? What's the legacy of the Truman's Brewery?
Well, Truman's was around for a long, long time. The normal date they gave for the founding was 1666. So basically right after the Great Fire. They were in the East End of London on Brick Lane, which is a very vibrant part of London. In the 18th century, they became really big with porter, one of the largest breweries in the world. Continued to be a pretty large brewery during the 19th century. Then in the 20th century, when a lot of the other breweries were merging, they stayed independent and ended up being the largest independent brewery left in London.
Derek, you've been brewing in London for, what is it now, 54 years?
Yes, it is. Well done. Your maths is very good. And still going in as well, occasionally, not as much. So still popping in.
Very good. I mean, that's incredible in of itself. But you started at Truman's.
I did. Yes. I started in Truman's in their laboratory in the summer of 1968, or the late summer of 1968. So I joined them as a lab technician. Originally, I was intending to do something completely different, but I fell within this wonderful environment of fascinating history, plus a product that I was, even at that relatively young age, quite keen on. So it just seemed like an ideal opportunity to have a bit of a career change. And I'm still enjoying the brewing industry, I'm pleased to say. The main brew house, and I think you have to really change your concept of what brew houses look like when you look at today's brew houses. Today's brew houses tend to be relatively small in terms of their brewing per brew capacity, but they do lots of multiple brews. But these brew houses were big, so we had 8 mash tuns feeding into 6 coppers to 2 hopbacks, and then 2 sides to the brewery. So it would be going in 2 separate directions with work receivers, work coolers, cool ships, up in the roofs, showing the technology which was just abandoned. And there were lots of rooms where you could find that probably people hadn't been for years. I loved being in at the weekend, which we did. We covered shift when I was on the brew team. And you could just wander around at the weekend and you'd go through a door and there would be this huge room above the hop store with the open coolers where the work would sit overnight with the vents either side of it. The nearest equivalent you could think of now would be Cantillon in Belgium, with the open coolers and the wind coming through, vents on either side. But it was just this great tray, very shallow, quite shallow, only about 6 to 8 inches deep.
I'm gonna get my beer now. Got a nice Bourbon County branded, it's like a cognac snifter.
Well, cheers anyway.
Cheers.
Yeah, cheers to you, gentlemen. We'll get to the tasting a little bit later, but I couldn't wait to sip on the beer. So we talked about Black Eagle is so on our label we say #1 English barley wine ale, barley wine. Ron, give us as much as you can a brief history overview of barley wine, when the first one call to barley wine was created, and the concise, well, I guess the beginnings. What's the beginnings of barley wine? Start there.
Beginnings of barley wine. Well, the beginnings of barley wine are various strong beers, but specifically the strong beers they brewed in Burton. So the beers that they brewed before pale ale. So Burton wasn't initially famous for pale ale. Burton was originally famous for strong brown ales. And you see this in the Burton breweries, that even people like Bass and Allsops, who were really into the whole pale ale business, they still produce the older type of Burton ales. And these were often numbered, and they went, in the case of Bass, they went from 1 to, I think, 8. And number 1 being the barley wine, and number 8, or I think 6, 7, and 8 being mild ales, and the ones in between being various other styles of beer. So it was a type of beer that had been brewed in Burton for a very long time, and which continued on through the pale ale period in Burton, which is quite interesting. Well, I mean, one of the whole reasons they started brewing pale ale in Burton was because they lost the Russian markets for their strong Burton ales in the 1820s, and so they wanted to find another export market, and they looked to India, and then they started brewing IPAs. So it's a bit intertwined, the history of the two beers. But yeah, I mean, the first references I can find to barley wine as a type of beer is from the 1870s, and it specifically refers to Bass number 1. So their number 1 Burton ale, so their top class, the strongest beer they produced, and other breweries did the same thing. And so Truman's was another Burton brewery, and so they called their top level beer exactly the same thing. And if you look at the Truman's, yeah,
For the coaster, original number 1 Burton.
Yeah, and if you look at their brewing records, they numbered their beers exactly the same way that Bass did. And so they've got beers that go from number 1 to number 8 in exactly the same way. And so, yeah, and you see other breweries as well have beers that they call number 1 ale, number 1 Burton ale, number 1 barley wine. And one of my favorites, which is Gold Label, that was called number 1 barley wine as well. Both the pale and the dark versions.
Derek, I believe they were making barley wine at Truman's in the 1960s, late 60s when you were there. Describe what it was like.
They were, although, as we know from the brewing records, most of the barley wine was brewed and bottled up in Burton. So what we were doing down in London, and my memories, stretching the memories a bit, but I'm fairly sure we were certainly bringing down some of the stock ale. We used to bring down in hogsheads the stock ale and what we used to call the PA1, which was the Ben Truman pale ale.
To me, like the blending piece, so the aging in oak, at least the stock piece, and blending it with the fresh beer, the runner. You know, we did that, granted with a different size vessel with Obadiah Poundage, but this to me is that fascinating aspect of British brewing history that not a lot of people are aware of. You know, they think of like you mentioned, the lambic breweries, or you know, like a Rodenbach doing Flanders styles.
And yet Rodenbach were copying British breweries.
Yes. Well, we know
exactly.
that, but I think these days the association with aging beer in wood and developing some acidity, you know, the Brettanomyces, of course, which means British fungus. I think that's a large part of the education of these beers that we've done. All 3, Ron, have had Brettanomyces. All 3 have touched wood, you know, Brewery Yard 100%. And then Obadiah Poundage and now Black Eagle are a blend of aged and fresh. That's what I found fascinating once I learned that history. Fascinating history. On to our beer. Of course, as I mentioned, Black Eagle. We wanted to reference. I showed this to you guys again. We'll put it up on the video. But with the label, of course, we wanted, as we always have, to be kind of respectful to history. Number 1 English Barley Wine Ale. So we brewed 2 batches of beer, of course, a 1960 Truman's S1, I believe, Ron.
Yeah,
The
S1.
recipe. Mostly Maris Otter, I think a little bit of Crystal, and then some invert number 3, invert sugar number 3, a darker invert syrup that we got from, I believe, Becker's in
Oh, you got it from
Michigan.
that?
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
Okay.
So the stock beer, I don't know if I actually told you guys this, but so the prior year we did a collaboration with Adnams, and specifically with their spirit barrels, their whiskey barrels. So we wanted to do an all English ingredient, English malt, English hops, English whiskey barrel stout. And so I talked to Fergus, and he arranged for some single malt casks to be sent over. And so we aged the beer in these Adnams casks. They're kind of built like a wine cask, and they're toasted. So we used them for this beer. And then again, talking to Ron about what the brewers would have wanted, going back all the way to Brewery Yard, very, very minimal to no oak perception. Really, we're looking for like a fairly oak neutral vessel for secondary fermentation. And so we rinsed and steamed these barrels after we took the beer out of it. So it had whiskey in it, I think 2 additions of whiskey over in England. Then it came here, we aged a beer in it for a year. Then we took the beer out and rinsed and steamed the barrels a number of times to really try to neutralize that impact of the oak. We put the stock beer into these casks, and then we added Brettanomyces clausenii. That kind of, again, that's one of the common threads between the 3 beers that we've done with Ron is clausenii. And again, we reference Brettanomyces, meaning British fungus. And so in clausenii is that, for me, of all the strains, that's the one that I associate either rightly or wrongly with like that British connection the most, because it was Clausen who named it after himself. That was, that identified it in these English stock beers. So I love the character of it. I love the character that the clausenii brings to the beer. So we aged the beer for 9 months in these casks, and then took it out of the casks, and of course made the runner, as we mentioned, a beer that is similar. Most of the components are the same. A lot of Maris Otter, as Ron mentioned, some flake maize. We used invert 1 instead of invert 3, a lower hopping rate, and blended the 2 together. And Derek, this was all coming back to you, and I think even Mike mentioned it in his email, that blending ratio, and it was the same as with Obadiah Poundage, is 2/3 of the running beer, aka fresh beer, to 1/3 of the aged beer, and that's how we blended this. What both of you can speak to this, but Derek first, like that was the ratio that you were aware of at that time?
I think it was a rule of thumb more than an absolute, Mike. I think it was a rule of thumb that we've used, and it depended a little bit on the volume that you had, but also on the palates of the beers. So it was a little bit of, and that was one of the things that I did in these, not very often, but the occasion I went down with Bert Downey, and we tried the beers in tank, because we transferred them out of the wooden hogsheads into glass line tanks to get them all together and see what we had. He was looking for this character where it had lost some of the dirtiness, but it carried with it that fruit tartness that you come to get with Brettanomyces, which it sort of goes through that initial slightly dirty farmyardy period and then seems to come out the other side. This is my feeling about it, my sort of experience, the way I see it, and it comes out with this sort of clean fruit tart fruit acidity, which is quite attractive, quite dark, in some, because of some of the malt characters and the strength of the beer. But that's the way it comes across to me. And,
well, I think you're describing quite well the beer I've got in my hands.
Yeah.
Because it's got a little bit of tartness, but mostly the Brettanomyces is coming across in fruit.
Yes. Yeah.
And so
it's lost that sort of leather farmyard that is often associated. And I think that's purely because it hasn't really run its time often.
Yeah,
And they did talk about keeping the beers. If you think back to our experience of the Obadiah Poundage and with what they were doing with the porters, that they were keeping these beers for a year minimum, really, so that this flavour was right before it was ready to be blended in to make the porter. It's a fascinating thing that really sadly fell away with all the changes.
What I find really interesting is that everything I ever read, it's always like this 2-to-1 ratio of fresh to young. It's the general rule of thumb.
It's a brewer's rule of thumb.
Yeah, and obviously people were blending for taste, I would imagine as well. But that seems to be the starting point, 2-to-1.
Yeah.
Derek, what now that we've finished, we're in the glass and you can taste it. What do you make of the beer?
Well, the first impressions, Mike, are the visuals. And when I opened the first bottle, my heart really lifted a little because it was bang on where I think the colour should be. And it also had this really good, rich, creamy head. So both of those things made my heart sing a little. And then I sort of, the visuals really impressed me. So that was a good start. And then you go on to the aroma. And we were talking about this a little earlier, because we did use a stock process with the Brett coming through. There is a risk that the Brett can make the beer taste a little bit over acid or a little bit dirty. And I don't get that at all. I get this sort of dark fruit acidity, this sort of sour cherry type aroma coming through, which I find really attractive. Almost a bit like a rich fruit Dundee cake. And for me, this really, really worked on the aroma. I thought it was great. I don't know what you found, Ron.
Yeah, I think it's like certain Belgian beers where the Brettanomyces mostly expresses itself in fruit type flavors, which is what I like. So rather than having loads of funkiness, you've mostly got, the fruit type flavors here and a little bit of acidity, but not too much.
Yeah.
Which I guess, I guess when we taste the straight aged beer, I guess the acidity is going to be a good few notches up from that.
I don't think we picked up, it's such a heavily hopped beer, that stock beer that I was always curious when you mentioned the acidity, Derek, because I know when we did Brewery Yard, of course, that was incredibly hopped. It's like 95 BU before. The pH didn't drop at all on Brewery Yard, not after a year.
Really?
And I think we may have dropped a touch here, but we didn't develop a bunch. We definitely, the aromatics, the aroma and the flavor, I'm with you, that Brettanomyces. And then once you blend in the fresh beer, of course, that lacing, like you wouldn't have that head and that lacing on a beer that was 100% wood. So in that creaminess, like you mentioned.
No, that's right. And I think that's why the blending works for me in particular. I think it's a nice way of offsetting what could be quite a heavy beer. If you just put it out straight, it would taste a bit heavier. But by having that drier, slightly fruit tartness coming through from the stock ale, it just lifts the palate in my book. It's a little bit like adding, for anybody out there that does it, balsamic vinegar to strawberries. It just lifts that fruit characteristic even more, and that's what I like about it. So I just take us back to the beer, because we've covered the appearance and the aroma. The palate, I think that little fruit acidity is carried through, but not as strongly, because I think here the running beer has softened it and brought it down to a more drinkable level. What I think it does do, it takes off the edge of the sort of sweetness and fullness that you could get if it was just brewed direct without that addition of the aged beer. So I think it really comes on with quite a lot of fruit promise. You then get the malt underneath kicking through. I get those plums and prunes type characteristics coming through. But it's not cloying. I don't find it cloying. Again, I think that slight addition of the mildly acidic beer just helps to take away the cloyingness that sometimes the heavier beers are prone to. The finish at the moment for me, I still get a little bitterness. It's still young in many respects. I expect that bitterness just to decline over time a bit, just to finish off that wryness. But it's quite, that almost dry on the finish, leaving you ready for another mouthful. In my case, how do you find it, Ron?
I find it quite drinkable, actually. It's nice. It's nice and fruity. As you say, it's not particularly cloying. It's quite nice and dry for the strength.
Yeah.
But the question I had for you is, does it taste like the original?
Well, if I could guarantee answering that truthfully, I don't know. As far as I could tell, it's pretty damn good. I mean, the only thing I could say is it's very close. It really, as far as I could tell, I didn't drink much barley wine at the time. It wasn't the beer to go and sip pints of, but of course we did taste it, and I did taste the stock when we had the small occasions to have it down. But I mean, it's very reminiscent of the barley wines of the time. But,
just to tack onto your tasting notes, those sweet caramel, brown sugar notes that come
the
through,
candy notes,
still make, it's still a barley wine. So I think a modern drinker, the Brettanomyces might be a little bit jarring just because they wouldn't expect that in a modern barley wine, but there's still a lot of that richness. It's 8.6% alcohol by volume. I think finishing gravity was about 7.5 Plato, so not a dry beer analytically, and there's some sweetness there, but there's also, like you mentioned, some bitterness to balance that out. That I think helps kind of keep it from cloying.
I mean, I think that's the thing. When I was just tasting it just now, I realized, well, yeah, it's a bit like a sort of Christmas cake, the flavor of it.
Exactly.
But that you don't necessarily get overwhelmed by the sweetness, because there's a fair amount of underlying bitterness, but there's quite a good balance between the two. So it doesn't feel like
great.
So it doesn't feel like, oh, this is a really bitter beer. It just feels like, you've got the right balance of the two elements.
Yeah, I quite agree, Ron. I think it's really nice, and I think it will develop and change slightly over time as well. With that little edge at the end, just softening off a little more and just making it even more balanced. So I think it's great. I think it's great now, and I think it will develop well.
Save a few bottles, Ron. Don't drink it all now.
Oh, well, that's easy for you to say. You there with a cellar full of the bloody things, aren't you?
I think in closing, I personally am very, very proud of the beer we made. Again, I know that we spared no expense on ingredients. We tried to really mimic the process as best we could, knowing that we've got a 20th century brew house, and but the techniques we used, I feel, are evoking the same flavor contributions that more or less would have been achieved in 1960 in both in Burton and in London. So I can say I'm proud of the beer we've made. It's always fun tasting history. Well, Ron and Derek, it's a pleasure finally having and tasting this beer with you in the glass. Cheers to both of you, and we'll have to start working on the next one very soon.
Indeed. Yeah. And I hope it's as good as this, Mike, because this is great.
Cheers.
Well done, well brewed.
Cheers, gentlemen.